What is populism, and could it be the future of politics? Let's find out in today's video. Populism is a political ideology, not one that you would find on a political spectrum or compass. You can't identify populism with any sort of partisan lines like liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican. Populism is more so a way that various politicians, including Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, and Huey Long, emphasize the idea of the ordinary people, with whom their message resonates more, allowing for a conflict to arise between two groups of opposing values, through which they can rally their base voting blocks, while also expanding their appeal to working and middle-class voters. Although, when considering populism, you shouldn't think about it as one concrete approach. There are many different variants of populism, and many different types of populists. So, let's break down the components of populism. The first and arguably most important aspect of populism is the common people, also known more simply as the people, a relatively vague and flexible term which has the ability to grow and contract based on the rhetoric a given populist is using. This is the group that the populist politicians attempt to mobilize by rallying the mass population, attempting to portray themselves as one of the people. The overarching nature of the term is helpful within populist politics, since a politician is then able to specify who they classify as being part of the people, and therefore who they're taking a stand and fighting for. For example, U.S. President Donald Trump classified the people as a group exclusive to United States citizens, then attempting to restrict membership of that group to Americans, campaigning against outsiders coming in from other countries like Mexico. Love him or hate him, he effectively targets a subgroup of the people as a strategy through which he's able to rally the Republican base. Don't believe it? Take Bernie Sanders as an example of populism from the other end of the political spectrum. It isn't hard to see that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump find themselves on polar opposites of the political spectrum, but Sanders also uses a similar strategy of appealing to the people, instead using a form of socialist populism, targeting the working class as his interpretation of the people, focusing on a variety of social programs to rally voters around ideas like Medicare for all, free college tuition, etc. Although, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders seek to create a narrative in which these subgroups of the people are considered the underdog, a David versus Goliath story, incentivizing the mass population to rally around a common goal, their common goal. But, for there to be a common rallying point in politics, there must always be some form of opposition. When it comes to populism, a commonly found form of opposition is referred to as the elites, the antagonistic force in the narrative, against which the people are commonly pinned. Although, as the ideology of populism continues to develop with time, this rigid system of conflict is becoming more and more fluid and flexible. Some political scientists argue that populism has a more rigid structure, and that populists are consequently dividers rather than uniters, since they're constantly pinning two groups against each other. However, we disagree with that assertion, since there's always going to be a conflict and rift in politics between opposing groups. Even with self-proclaimed pluralist democracies like the United States, Canada, Germany, etc., where you hope to represent various groups through legislative bodies like parliaments, congresses, Bundestags, there will always be some sort of conflict with each political party attempting to push their political agenda and increase its popularity. The nature of politics is to convince the population why their idea is better than another party's ideas. Rather than calling populists dividers, we would more so call them extenders, since they realize they're never going to convince 100% of the population, but they try to expand their appeal with time. The flexible nature of the group which they refer to as the people allows for them to expand and contract the group they're trying to rally. If more people are attracted to their cause, then their definition of the people grows to encompass those who have newly joined. If more people go to support an opposition party, then their group of supporters contracts. This is the case for most modern populists. An example of this would be the United States Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, whose definition of the people is quite flexible, not basing it off of income, but dependent on political leanings, attempting, as with any other politician, to persuade the population into supporting his ideas and policies, claiming that he would allow rich individuals to join his campaign as long as they were okay with increasing taxes on the rich. He's a millionaire and runs a movement for taxing the rich. U.S. President Donald Trump leads a populist movement most common with working and middle-class individuals from rural areas, despite being a billionaire from Manhattan. With modern populism, whether someone is part of the people is a classification based not on socioeconomic status or characteristics, but instead on how well their ideas match with those of the populist politicians. A prime example of a modern populist take on politics is the Premier of the province of Ontario in Canada, Doug Ford. From his election campaign in 2018 up until the current point, his popularity with Ontarians has fluctuated greatly due to various circumstances. During the election campaign, much of his campaigning was up against the extremely unpopular Liberal Premier Kathleen Wynne. The definition of the people encompassed both his party's voter base and everyone who felt dissatisfied with the extremely unpopular Wynne government. After the election, his popularity began decreasing, and the goal became to maintain his base voters. The definition of the people contracted to allow him to focus more on strengthening his base. Then, due to his fast and smart response towards the 2020 global health crisis, his approval rating skyrocketed to 74%, initiating a new significant expansion of the people to include a large array of new members who agreed with Ford's handling of the situation. This elastic version of populism is what a good portion of mainstream populist politicians are tending towards in recent years. However, there are also other forms of populism, some of which can be a bit distasteful. One such distasteful form of populism is right-wing populism, which we would argue to be the opposite of a much more positive modern populism, since it does not possess the same elastic or adaptive quality towards its definition of the people. Rather than classifying the people based on their political values, it chooses instead to focus on the distinction of race, ethnicity, religion, etc. Proponents of this form of populism include Steve Bannon, Marine Le Pen, and a certain angry German man. Extreme ideologies such as these, which focus on racial discrimination, tend to rear their ugly faces during times of desperation and crisis. Germany during the 1920s and 1930s, prior to Mr. Angry Mustache's rule, had suffered multiple economic crises such as hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and the Great Depression, leading to increased popularity of extreme right and left wings of the political spectrum. A similar phenomenon occurred in modern-day politics following the Great Recession of 2008-2009, when the economically hard-hit country of Greece saw a surge in popularity for their right-wing party known as the Golden Dawn, which has more than a few questionable tendencies. However, right-wing populism, compared to the whole picture of populism, is a relatively small vocal minority, which leads to stigmatization of the movement collectively. But keeping with the political and ideological extremes, one must also consider left-wing populism, which is the more stereotypically rigid economic version of populism, consisting of an anti-elitist sentiment, anti-capitalism, social justice, and socialist class society theory. An example of a prominent left-wing populist is the infamous Venezuelan dictator Hugo Chavez, who heavily criticized American-style capitalism and modified Venezuela's economy into a socialist system, and criticizing the prior administration for only advancing the interests of wealthy economic elites within Venezuela. In exchange, left-wing populism emphasizes the transferal of money back to the state and its transformation into social programs which could benefit working-class people. However, having such power in the hands of the state allows many a corrupt politician to take advantage of a system and pocket much of the money which should be going to the people instead. Due to people's ethical and judgmental imperfections, it is extremely difficult to create a functional economy and state on the basis of left-wing populism. However, both right-wing and left-wing populism are relatively small portions of the current political and populist scenes. Therefore, they should not be able to discredit the whole of populism, which includes the more flexible and beneficial modern populism initially discussed. Additionally, there are other older forms of populism that are less involved in contemporary politics. There also exists a variety of add-on ideologies which have been seen historically alongside populism. This can include paternalism, which is the limitation of individual freedoms in exchange for a promotion of safety and/or well-being, whether the trade-off be legitimate or not. Ochlocracy, also known as mob rule, where the mass directly controls government rather than legitimate authorities, and a few more country-specific examples. Although many of these affiliations are becoming increasingly rare as populism increasingly favors its more modern and flexible form, which allows it to become a more independent ideology, autonomous of tag-along ideologies. Although, populism still does have to be accompanied by some sort of ideology found on the political spectrum, since modern populism is not a partisan ideology, but rather a means of promoting policies and ideas. Yet, if we're to talk about populism, we also have to mention pluralism, which is largely considered to be populism's opposite. Pluralism is the political philosophy that argues for the division of power between various political factions within a political body as to represent the variety of interests that all people have within a country, commonly found in pluralist democracies, a type of democracy where the national government's power is concentrated in multiple centers. Admittedly, this is a positive way of structuring government to ensure that it does not enter a state of authoritarianism and tyranny, where a dictatorial figure can take complete control. However, the accusation that populists are inherently dividers, whereas pluralists are inherently uniters, made by pluralist advocates such as Cass Mudd, has a central mistake in its logic. No politician, indifferent of how democratic your country is, can represent all groups of people equally. An ideologically liberal government is not representing ideologically conservative or socialist voters. It promotes liberal ideas which mostly benefit liberals. For said liberal government, the people are liberal supporters and potential liberal supporters. Now, we can already hear you typing in the comments, but that's why there's an opposition party, be it conservative, socialist, etc. But our rebuttal to that is they do not receive the same power stemming from the executive branch of government. There's only one prime minister, president, and so on. Whatever faction holds that spot benefits more. Even if one party holds the presidency and another holds the Senate, they do not represent everyone. There are still hundreds of parties not getting represented by either. Each of the parties still benefits disproportionately from their position of power. Countries such as the United States, Canada, and more, which claim to be pluralist, do not represent people equally in the fashion which pluralism claims they should. The image of an ideal pluralist politician who looks out for everyone 100% equally is impossible. They don't exist. Also, a modern populist doesn't only benefit their voter base. In attempting to promote their own political faction, they reach out to and benefit all sorts of different voter blocs, since they recognize that by doing it, they can simultaneously benefit the population and expand the definition of the people. By recognizing the imperfections in the pluralist system, populists are more capable of including more people into a dynamic and shifting group of the people, beating out pluralists who divide up their attention in 100 different directions and end up having less of a significant impact on any individual group. Instead, populists within a democratic system are capable of focusing on one group for a few months, another for a few months, taking an in-depth look in how they can create the most significant difference through bold actions. This rule does have its exceptions, of course, since politics isn't an exact science. However, we do argue that populism acts as an effective and legitimate form of governance, which can benefit the world's democracies. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Also, down below in the description, we have a bunch of further readings about this if you're interested in the topic of populism or pluralism, anything of that sort. Hope you have a great day. Bye!